On a June afternoon in 1886, a jury filed back into London's Old Bailey after deliberating for barely 2 hours. The gallery held its breath, packed with spectators who had followed every day of testimony in the papers. The woman in the dock had already lost her husband, her freedom for nearly a year, and most of her reputation. What the jury said next would end one of the strangest murder trials in Victorian England, without ever answering the one question everyone actually wanted solved. How did a fatal dose of poison end up inside a man's stomach without leaving a single mark on the way in? To understand that verdict, we have to go back roughly 10 years. Adelaide Blanche de la Tremoille's own origins were almost as unusual as the case that would later make her famous. Most historical accounts describe her as likely illegitimate, born to a father who arranged for part of her schooling in convent institutions on the European continent, which left her fluent in French and unusually well read for a woman of her station in Victorian London. That upbringing gave her a certain independence of mind, one that friends found charming at first and, years later, a suspicious jury would find very difficult to ignore. Adelaide was reportedly around 19 when she married Edwin Bartlett, a London grocer with a restless habit of self-improvement schemes. Their marriage was unusual from the outset. By his own account, Edwin wanted a wife he could shape entirely to his own tastes, sent away for stretches of further schooling, kept apart from ordinary domestic life, molded rather than simply married. Acquaintances found the arrangement strange even by the standards of the day. Adelaide, often isolated during these early years, later described them as a long lesson in obedience to her husband's particular wishes. By the mid-1880s, the Bartlett household had a new fixture, Reverend George Dyson, a young Wesleyan minister who had become a close family friend. Rather than resenting the friendship, Edwin, whose health was already declining, appeared to actively encourage it. He introduced Dyson to visitors as, in his own words, his wife's particular friend, and by several accounts seemed to sanction a closeness between the two that went further than most Victorian husbands would have tolerated. Letters later read aloud in court showed Adelaide writing to Dyson in terms of open, unmistakable affection. Edwin Bartlett's health had never been strong, and by the final weeks of 1885 it was failing quickly, stomach pain, mood swings, and a string of inconsistent diagnoses from at least 3 different doctors. On the evening of December the 31st, Adelaide asked their physician, Dr. Alfred Leach, for a prescription of chloroform, explaining that Edwin sometimes suffered agitated, jealous fits at night and that she wanted something on hand to settle him. Leach agreed, with one explicit instruction. Sprinkle it on a handkerchief for him to inhale. Never let him drink it. Liquid chloroform, swallowed rather than inhaled, was known even then to badly burn the mouth, throat, and stomach on its way down. In the early hours of January 1, 1886, Adelaide woke the household to say Edwin was dead. He was found lying peacefully in bed, still warm, his features undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle, no burns around his mouth, nothing consistent with the violent, corrosive reaction that swallowed chloroform was expected to cause. And yet when Dr. Leach carried out the post-mortem, he found a full, unburned dose of liquid chloroform sitting inside Edwin Bartlett's stomach. Enough to kill him, delivered by a substance that should have injured him severely simply going in. That single detail is what turned an ordinary domestic tragedy into a full-blown medical sensation. Liquid chloroform is intensely irritating. Anyone swallowing enough of it to be lethal should, by every clinical expectation of the era, have gagged, choked, and scarred their throat in the process. Edwin showed none of that. No one, not the treating physician, not the pathologists later called in, could explain how a fatal dose reached his stomach without leaving a mark on the way in. The toxicologists who testified at trial openly contradicted one another under oath. Newspapers gave the case a nickname that stuck, the Pimlico mystery, after the London district where the Bartletts lived. Suspicion fell immediately on the two people closest to Edwin, his wife, and the minister who had grown so close to her. Investigators discovered that in the days before Edwin's death, Adelaide had asked Dyson to purchase chloroform from several different chemists around London, buying only small amounts at each shop so as not to draw attention. Dyson admitted to doing exactly that, insisting he believed it was for a scent mixture Adelaide told him she was preparing. Both were arrested and charged with murder. The prosecution's theory was straightforward: Adelaide administered the poison, with Dyson's unwitting help, to clear the way for a future together. The 10-day trial at the Old Bailey became a public sensation, covered daily across London's newspapers. Adelaide's private letters to Dyson were read aloud in open court, revealing an intimacy the prosecution called clear motive and the defense insisted was nothing more than misjudged affection. Adelaide herself never testified. Under the law at the time, defendants in murder trials were not permitted to give evidence in their own defense, a rule that would only change years later. Her case rested almost entirely on the arguments of her barrister, the formidable Sir Edward Clarke. Sir Edward Clarke's closing speech for the defense is still remembered by legal historians as one of the most effective ever delivered at the Old Bailey. Rather than trying to prove Adelaide's innocence outright, he focused entirely on reasonable doubt, reminding the jury repeatedly that a conviction required more than suspicion, more than an unconventional marriage, more than a set of compromising letters. It required proof of how the crime was actually carried out, and on that single point, the prosecution's own expert witnesses could not agree with one another, let alone convince 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt. To strengthen the case against Adelaide, prosecutors had granted Reverend Dyson immunity in exchange for his testimony, effectively removing him from consideration as a suspect before the trial had even concluded. Even the presiding judge criticized the decision from the bench. Left without any workable theory of exactly how the poison had been delivered, and unwilling to convict on suspicion alone, the jury returned after less than 2 hours, not guilty. Adelaide Bartlett walked out of the Old Bailey a free woman, into a public that remained deeply and permanently divided over what she had, or hadn't, actually done. News of the acquittal split British public opinion right down the middle. Some newspapers hailed the verdict as proof that no one should be convicted on suspicion and unflattering personal letters alone. Others were convinced the justice system had simply failed to catch a clever poisoner, aided by a hopelessly contradictory set of medical experts. Satirical cartoons and music hall songs referenced the Pimlico mystery for years afterward, cementing Adelaide Bartlett's name in Victorian popular culture long after the legal case itself had been closed for good. The case became so notorious in medical circles that Sir James Paget, one of the most respected surgeons of the era, is widely reported to have remarked that now she had been acquitted, Adelaide ought to tell the profession, purely in the interest of science, exactly how she had done it. She never did. According to most historical accounts, Adelaide left England not long afterward, possibly for the United States, and simply disappeared from the historical record. No later sightings, no memoir, no deathbed confession has ever surfaced in over a century of interest in the case. Reverend Dyson left the ministry under a cloud of scandal and also largely vanished from public life. In the decades since, Toxicologists and historians have proposed several competing explanations. One theory holds that Edwin may have swallowed the chloroform himself, mixed into another drink he didn't recognize, which could have masked the burning sensation before it took full effect. Another suggests Adelaide gave it to him while he was already partly sedated from an earlier dose, dulling the reflex to gag or wake. A minority view points to Edwin himself, a documented hypochondriac known for dosing himself with unusual remedies, and asks whether he might have taken it deliberately or by tragic accident, with no involvement from his wife at all. None of these theories has ever been proven, and none likely ever will be. What the Pimlico mystery left behind was never a solved case. It became a permanent case study instead. Trial transcripts from 1886 are still cited in discussions of chloroform absorption, reflexive swallowing, and the real limits of what post-mortem evidence can prove in a courtroom. It stands as one of the clearest historical examples of a jury declining to convict on suspicion alone, however overwhelming that suspicion appeared from the outside, simply because no one could reconstruct how the crime, if it was a crime, had actually been carried out. It's a story that sits awkwardly between two eras, modern enough to have detailed medical testimony and cross-examined experts, yet distant enough that the truth was allowed to disappear along with the people who actually knew it. Adelaide Bartlett is neither a confirmed murderer nor a genuinely cleared innocent in any meaningful historical sense. She's something rarer in true crime storytelling, a verdict without a resolution, a case where not guilty and we will never know what really happened turned out to mean almost exactly the same thing. Every generation of readers who rediscovers this case seems to land somewhere different, which may be the truest measure of how well the mystery has held up. That's the story of the Pimlico mystery, a poisoning with no confession, a trial with no clear mechanism, and a woman the law set free without ever settling what she had done. If you're interested in more forgotten cases from history's cold files, cases closed by a courtroom but never truly closed in the historical record, this channel is where we cover them. Thanks for watching Crime Clip Vault.